The text tone buzzed beside the gift box when my daughter-in-law wrote, "We already celebrated without you." Still, I stared at the ribbon I tied myself, the one labeled for my family. As the frosting's scent drifted from the untouched cake, it started to smell like pity. While it sat there melting, I recalled the years I called her daughter and meant every word. The same woman I welcomed like blood had now made me the outsider at my own table. That's when I picked up the box and drove to the bank where I unwrapped their inheritance. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The text came in just after I set the table for 5. I arranged the tulips David once said reminded him of spring mornings with me, roasted a lemon-herb chicken, his favorite, and even folded the napkins the way Megan likes them. I wasn't expecting fanfare, just a simple dinner. A way to stay connected. It had been 2 weeks since I last saw them. Ping. We already celebrated without you, so no need to come, hope you're well. That was it, no greeting, no punctuation, even just a flat dismissal from Megan dressed up like politeness. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. The table in front of me felt suddenly ridiculous, too carefully set, too hopeful. I didn't reply. What was there to say? I sat down slowly, easing into the chair across from where my son would have sat. My mind began to drift, not into anger, not yet, but into memory. There was last Christmas when Megan forgot to tell me they moved the celebration to her sister's house. David claimed it slipped his mind. Or the time they announced their pregnancy at a brunch I wasn't invited to. Megan said she thought I wouldn't be interested in a younger crowd gathering. It hadn't always been like this. When David brought Megan home from college, I was nothing but warm. I gave them the downstairs apartment rent-free when they were saving for their first house. I helped with the down payment. Megan sent a thank you card, a single sentence, no signature. The first few years I excused it. She was ambitious, busy. Then it became clear I was inconvenient. I picked up the plate of chicken and scraped it into the trash. I didn't want leftovers. I wanted clarity. I wanted to know how I had become so optional. I thought of David. Not once in the past few months had he come by without her. When I called, he was heading into a meeting or just walking into the house. Always quick to hang up, always apologetic, never present. But I remember every parent-teacher night I sat through alone when Richard was still building his firm. Every late-night fever I soothed with cold compresses and whispered lullabies. I never missed a birthday, never said no when they needed help. And now I was told via text I wasn't needed, that they'd celebrated something, God knows what, without me. I stood there holding the napkin I'd folded just so. My throat felt tight, but the tears didn't come. I didn't let them. Instead, I wiped down the spotless counter, washed the unused wine glasses, and packed away the cloth napkins. Each motion felt deliberate, cleansing, like I was preparing not just the kitchen but myself for something else. I didn't need an apology. I didn't even need David to call. What I needed was a different kind of celebration. I picked up my phone not to respond to Megan's text but to open my contacts. Scrolling down to Jennifer Porter, I hit call. She picked up on the second ring. Sylvia, everything all right? I'd like to review my estate plan, I said, keeping my voice steady, and I want to make some changes. There was a pause, then her voice warm but sharp. Tell me when, I'll make time. Tomorrow morning 9. I ended the call and stood still for a moment in the silence of my kitchen. A silence I hadn't chosen, but one I could finally start owning. I poured myself a glass of wine, took one sip, then set it down. I didn't need it. I walked into the living room, past the family photo from 5 years ago before the distance had names. Megan's smile back then looked real. Maybe it was. Maybe this was always going to happen. I turned the frame face down. Then I went upstairs and opened the drawer where I kept Richard's old files, life insurance, bank accounts, the trust he built for the family. Tomorrow, I'd begin celebrating in a way that couldn't be canceled. And I'd do it alone, exactly the way they wanted. But this time on my terms. Jennifer's office sat on the second floor of a modest brick building overlooking a quiet stretch of Maple Avenue, the kind of place people drove past without noticing, which suited me. I didn't want attention, I wanted clarity. She greeted me with a firm hug, then motioned me toward the chair across from her desk, oak, worn at the corners, steady in the way I suddenly needed to be. She didn't waste time with small talk. She simply opened a file and slid it toward me. "Walk me through what's on your mind," she said. For a moment, I studied the papers before touching them. Line after line in Richard's handwriting, notes, revisions, instructions, looked back at me. Even after all these years, his planning felt like a hand on my shoulder. He built a structure meant to protect the family. What he hadn't accounted for was how that word family could shift. "I want to understand exactly what control I still have," I said, keeping my voice steady, "and what I can change without involving anyone else." Jennifer nodded, lacing her fingers thoughtfully. "You have more authority than you realize. Richard set things up to give you independence, not oversight. These accounts, trusts, every designation here is yours to amend." I traced a line down one of the forms, feeling something loosen inside me. I had assumed so much of this was fixed, immovable, untouchable. But the truth sat quietly in front of me. I wasn't trapped in anything. "None of this requires notice?" I asked. "No," she said, "not to David and certainly not to Megan." A small smile tugged at her mouth, professional but knowing. "You can restructure everything on your terms, and frankly, it may be time." Time, yes, I felt the word settle into me. She walked me through each account, what could be separated, what could be reassigned, what could be shielded. The clearer the picture became, the more I felt something shift, an internal recalibration I hadn't expected. For years, I'd tied my decisions to the hope of being included. Now, I could finally separate myself from that weight. When Jennifer leaned back, she asked, "Do you want to update your beneficiary list today?" "I do." My own answer surprised me, not because it was decisive, but because it was calm. We worked in silence for several minutes, updating, crossing out, reorganizing. No anger guided my pen, just a quiet understanding of what was mine to protect. When we finished, Jennifer slid the updated pages toward me. "This secures your assets. If anyone tries to challenge your decisions later, you'll be on solid ground." I pressed my palm flat against the stack, absorbing the reality of it. Megan's dismissiveness, her small exclusions, they no longer felt like wounds. They felt like explanations, reasons to stop placing my value in a household that treated me like an afterthought. "I'm done tying my worth to how they treat me," I murmured. Jennifer didn't respond with comfort or platitudes. Instead, she offered something better. "Then let's make sure your future reflects that." When I left the office, the winter air brushed cold against my face, but I felt sharper, clearer. I sat in my car with the documents on my lap, their weight grounding me. One by one, I began calling the financial institutions listed on the first page. Each conversation was procedural, straightforward, confirming identity, submitting forms, initiating transfers. But underneath those sterile exchanges, something else was taking shape. With every hold music loop and every confirmation number, I felt the distance widening, not the hurt kind, but the healthy kind, a boundary sliding into place. The last representative ended with, "Your update is officially in process, Mrs. Edwards. You'll receive final confirmation soon." I ended the call and rested both hands on the steering wheel, letting the silence fill the car. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't waiting to be chosen. But as I started the engine, a thought surfaced, uninvited, unsettling. How long would it take before Megan realized something was shifting, and what would she do when she did? Back home, I opened the hall closet and pulled down the gift bag I'd hidden behind the old winter blankets. Cream-colored, trimmed with gold ribbon, Megan's taste. Expensive enough to be noticed, understated enough to avoid gratitude. Inside was a silk scarf from Italy, a soft lavender that matched a blouse I once saw her wear at brunch. I remembered hovering by the shop window 3 weeks ago, debating whether it was too much, whether it would be enough. I sat at the kitchen table, the scarf draped across my lap like a fragile apology I never owed. I'd planned to give it to her during the dinner that never happened, thought maybe it would thaw something, show her I was still trying. Now I could hardly stand to look at it. Over the years, gifts had become a kind of currency between us, one I always paid in full. The housewarming envelope with the check folded 3 times, the antique baby bracelet I gave her when she was pregnant. Even the catered birthday dinner 2 years ago when David was too busy to plan anything. I handled it all, quietly, generously. And each time I'd been met with the same tight smile, the same cool thank you, as if gratitude had an expiration date the moment she accepted something. I folded the scarf back into the tissue paper, sealing the bag as if to bury something deeper. I would not give it to her, not now, not ever. Let their celebration pass unnoticed by me the same way they let me pass unnoticed by it. In that silence, I felt something solid click into place inside me. I slid the bag back into the closet behind the same blankets. Maybe I'd donate it later, maybe I wouldn't, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I no longer needed Megan to feel pleased with me, or obligated to me, or anything at all. Later that afternoon, I sat at the dining room table not to scroll through photos or check texts, but to remove the noise. I deactivated my social media accounts with quiet finality. No more birthday reminders, no more staged smiles from people who didn't call. The silence that followed felt deliberate, earned. I brewed a pot of chamomile tea and opened the window a crack, letting in the cold. The stillness of the house didn't feel heavy anymore, it felt clean, wide, like space I could breathe in. That evening I called Jennifer again. I want to make sure everything we started is locked down, no gaps, no technicalities Megan or anyone else could use to argue later. I'm already reviewing it all, she said. I'll have an updated summary for you by the end of the week. Her voice, calm and exact, was exactly what I needed to hear. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of water and walked into the living room. The framed photo I'd turned faced on the night before still sat in silence on the console table. I didn't turn it back up. Instead, I picked it up entirely and slid it into the drawer. Megan could keep her party. She could keep her already celebrated. She could keep whatever imagined upper hand she thought she had. Because as I stood there in my quiet, undecorated home, no balloons, no champagne, no camera-ready smiles, I realized something that made my breath catch in my throat. I didn't feel left out. I felt free. But the question lingered like a shadow by the window. When Megan realizes the gift isn't coming, will she understand what she's really lost? The first message came on a Monday morning. I saw Megan's name flash across my phone while I was clipping hydrangeas in the backyard. The text preview was short. Just checking in, hope everything's okay. I let the screen dim and returned to the garden. The sky was cloudless, the air crisp with the last breath of fall. I hadn't felt this still in years. By Wednesday, another one arrived. Not sure why you've gone silent. David says you're busy. No, David hadn't called, not once. On Friday, she sent a longer message, this one wrapped in faux concern. I'm starting to feel really confused by your behavior. If I did something to upset you, it would have been nice to hear directly instead of being iced out. There was nothing subtle about it anymore. Her tone carried that sharp edge she always disguised as civility, as if I owed her a seat at the table she refused to let me near. I didn't answer, not because I didn't have words, I had too many, but none of them would have changed anything. Instead, I went to Helen's that afternoon. Her house smelled like spiced cider and wood polish, always a comfort. She poured us both tea and listened as I told her about the messages, her eyebrows arched with each one. She's not worried about you, Helen said bluntly. She's worried you're finally not playing the game. I sipped slowly, letting that truth settle. I think she's used to me circling back, explaining, apologizing. Helen leaned forward. Don't you dare pick up that rope, you don't owe her your peace. She was right, Megan's chaos had always depended on my participation. Later that night, I turned my phone face down and placed it in the drawer. I didn't want to hear the ping. I didn't want her version of concern filling my quiet spaces. Silence, I realized, wasn't just absence. It was a presence of its own, intentional, defiant healing. Days passed. I read for pleasure again, slowly, a chapter at a time. I cleaned the guest bedroom just because I liked the lavender scent of the linens. I took walks without my phone. When the sun dipped low behind the trees, I stood at the window and let the gold light spill across the room like an old song I'd forgotten I loved. Megan kept texting. "Are you okay? Did something happen? I'm starting to get really frustrated, Sylvia." Each message was a thread she tossed, hoping I'd grab hold and pull, but I wouldn't. What struck me most was David's silence. No missed calls, no voicemails, not even a weak attempt at middle ground peacemaking. He disappeared behind her as he often did. Maybe that was the part that stung more than I expected. My only son. But even that ache didn't weaken my resolve. If anything, it sharpened it. Every unanswered message reminded me that I didn't have to be what they expected. I didn't have to perform forgiveness just to be tolerated. On Sunday, I met Helen at the community garden Tuvalu. Here, we planted winter kale and trimmed back the rosemary. The cold bit at our fingers, but the laughter warmed the space between us. "You know," Helen said, dusting dirt off her gloves, "not responding is sometimes the loudest thing you can do." I smiled at that, not just because it was true, but because it finally felt like something I was allowed to do. That evening, as I made soup and played a record I hadn't touched in years, the phone buzzed again. This time it was Megan. It was David. Just one word. "Mom." I stared at it, not an apology, not even a real question, just a placeholder, a guilt offering from someone too used to me doing the work of reconciliation. I didn't reply. Instead, I muted the thread. And as I leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the steam rise from the pot, a realization settled over me like a second skin. What if the next call isn't a question but a threat? By the time I woke the next morning, the air in the house felt different, lighter, almost hollow, like something had shifted overnight. Maybe it had. I'd muted both Megan and David's threads, and the silence that followed felt earned, not unsettling. I made coffee, sat at the dining table, and pulled Jennifer's document packet closer. Yesterday's strength hadn't faded, it had settled into something steadier, a kind of internal quiet I hadn't known in years. The first page listed the trust structure Richard and I created when David was still in his 20s, long before Megan entered the picture. David, primary beneficiary; Megan, contingent. Even seeing their names printed in that order made something inside me tighten. I uncapped my pen. For a moment, I just held it there, hovering above the page. Then the decision became solid. One stroke. Then another. David's name disappeared beneath a clean line. Megan S2, no hesitation, no tremor in my hand. In their place, I wrote the names of the nieces and nephews who had shown up for me without expecting anything in return, people who cooked for me when I was sick, who remembered birthdays without social media reminders, who didn't treat me like a resource. When I finished, I exhaled slowly, not realizing I'd been holding my breath. It felt less like rewriting a will and more like reclaiming my own history. I moved to the next form: assets, directives, distributions. The lake house Megan once hinted she already pictured the kids running around in now had a different future. So did Richard's investment account and the insurance policy she once told David they should probably manage someday. My hand stayed steady as I reassigned everything. Halfway through the revisions, my phone buzzed. Megan again. "Still waiting on the transfer, we need it sorted this week." Not a question, not concern, no acknowledgement of my silence, only expectation, sharper now, almost irritated. She truly believed my role in their lives was fixed and permanent, that my generosity was automatic, that I existed to supplement hers. And the worst part, I'd let her believe it. A realization landed with a cold clarity: Megan hadn't changed. She'd simply grown comfortable using me. I had been a convenience: financial, emotional, familial, predictable. Not anymore. I placed the phone face down and continued rewriting my instructions with a calm I barely recognized. When I finished the final page, I slid the entire packet into a large envelope. It was heavier than I expected. Maybe because it wasn't just documents, it was the sum of every boundary I never set, now finally drawn. I drove to Jennifer's office without overthinking it. She opened the door before I knocked, as if she sensed the shift in me. You brought everything, she asked. I did. She took the envelope, her eyes scanning my face. This is a significant change, Sylvia. It's overdue. For a moment, she seemed to study me, really study me, then nodded. I'll review and process it today. Walking back to my car, the cold air cut across my cheeks, waking every nerve. I felt more present than I had in months, as if I was finally stepping into my own life, not the version others assigned to me. Before I started the engine, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Megan. But this one didn't sound impatient. It sounded suspicious. We need to talk now. No please, no explanation, just a tight, commanding sentence that told me exactly what she feared. Something was happening behind the scenes. Something she wasn't controlling. I stared at the message as a slow, deliberate pulse of adrenaline moved through me. For the first time, Megan wasn't poking for attention. She was sensing a threat. And she was right. The summons came in a thin white envelope delivered by hand, not mail. The courier didn't say a word, just handed it to me and walked off like he was dropping off a pizza. Inside, Megan's name was stamped in black ink. Petition to challenge estate modifications. No surprise, just confirmation. I called Jennifer before I even set the envelope down. She's filing formally, I said, suing me. Jennifer didn't sound rattled. I expected it. Will respond. She has no legal standing unless she can prove fraud, coercion, or incompetence, and she can't. I know, I said, but she'll still try. And Megan did. Within 2 days, her voice was in my ears again, just not directly. A neighbor, Elaine from 2 doors down, stopped me mid-walk. Heard there's some drama going on. Megan's been saying you cut David out of everything, that you've changed. I kept my expression still. I haven't changed, I've clarified. Elaine blinked at that, then offered a tight smile and stepped back. Message received. Megan had always been clever. She wasn't just attacking me through legal channels, she was painting a public picture. One where I was the cold, aging mother-in-law hoarding wealth out of spite. Even Helen had heard. She cornered me at the grocery store, Helen said, handing me a paper bag full of pears. Went on about how this whole thing is breaking David's heart, that you're making it impossible to keep the family together. I raised an eyebrow. Family wasn't her concern when she uninvited me. Helen snorted. I told her you're finally protecting yourself. You should have seen her face. The more Megan talked, the more people seemed to start wondering, not just about the lawsuit but about her. The edges of her curated image started to fray. Her tone was off. Her timeline didn't match what others remembered. I didn't counter her publicly. I didn't need to. Jennifer did that for me in motion after motion. She was precise, controlled. For every baseless accusation, we had a receipt. For every claim of mistreatment, we had silence. Emails ignored, holidays skipped, years of distance now reframed as self-preservation. One evening, Jennifer came by with the newest stack of filings. She's pivoting now, she said, spreading the papers across my dining table, trying to argue that Richard intended the assets to remain in David's direct line. It's weak, but she's betting on emotional sympathy from the court. I looked at the signature block. Megan's attorney had shifted tactics again, softer language, more appeal to tradition, as if painting this as a betrayal would somehow overwrite the years of neglect that brought us here. I poured Jennifer a cup of tea. Let them chase intentions, I'm focused on facts. And I was. The legal process moved slowly, but I was ready for every inch of it. I showed up to every deposition calm, well-dressed, and concise. I spoke only when asked. I didn't raise my voice, didn't blink when Megan tried to look sympathetic across the table. Helen came with me once, sat in the back of the room like my silent anchor. Afterward, as we walked through the courthouse lobby, Helen looked over at me. You scare her now, you know that. I looked at the polished floor beneath us. Good. The silence between filings was almost worse than the hearings. I'd sit by the window with my tea, wondering how Megan was recalibrating behind the scenes. Not whether, but how. Every time her strategy failed, she pivoted. That was her gift. One night, Jennifer called. Her tone was calm but laced with something tighter. They've subpoenaed Richard's old attorney. They're trying to claim he made verbal promises, ones not written in the documents. I closed my eyes for a beat. She's not going to stop, is she? No, Jennifer said, not until you shut the door completely. I looked at the fire crackling in the hearth. Then let's shut it. But I knew it wouldn't be enough to win the case, not for Megan, not with what she was losing. She wouldn't accept defeat quietly, she'd look for someone weaker, and I had a sick feeling I knew exactly who she'd turn on next. The courthouse hallway smelled faintly of old paper and depolished floors, the kind of scent that never changed no matter how modern the world became. I stood outside courtroom 4B with Jennifer beside me, her briefcase clasped in one hand, her expression unreadable. Ready? She asked. I didn't feel brave exactly, but I felt anchored, yes. Inside, the room buzzed softly, papers shifting, attorneys whispering, the slow hum of tension. Megan sat at the opposite table, her posture straight, outfit immaculate, face composed in a way that tried very hard not to look desperate. David sat behind her. His eyes flicked toward me for a moment, uncertain, almost pleading, but Megan nudged his arm and he looked away. The crack I'd expected in him wasn't breaking open yet. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair pulled back into a low twist, took her seat. Everyone rose, then we began. Megan Edwards, her attorney started, is here today because she believes Mrs. Sylvia Edwards' recent alterations to her will and trust are both unfair and uncharacteristic. These changes were made rashly and without proper consideration for the family structure. Family structure, I almost laughed at the audacity. Jennifer rose smoothly. Your Honor, my client made changes within her legal rights, changes supported by documentation, testimony, and a years-long pattern of mistreatment by the petitioner. Mrs. Edwards has maintained control of her finances since her husband's passing, and nothing about these revisions is irregular. Megan's lawyer stepped forward, tapping his pen. Irregular, she cut out her only child. Jennifer replied without hesitation. Adult children are not entitled to inherit. And in this case, Mrs. Edwards' motivation was self-protection, precisely because her daughter-in-law has repeatedly attempted to access her funds. A ripple of whispers moved through the courtroom. Megan stiffened. The judge nodded, turning her attention to Megan. Mrs. Edwards, Megan, please explain why you believe these changes were unfair. Megan stood slowly, smoothing the hem of her blazer. She inhaled deeply, just loud enough to be noticed. I've tried, she began, eyes purposely softening. I've tried to keep this family together. I've included Sylvia in everything I could, but lately she's disconnected, acting distant, and now she's cut my husband and children out of what Richard intended for them. Her voice quivered at the end, fabricated, practiced, but effective at least to someone who didn't know her. Jennifer leaned close to me. Don't react. I didn't. Megan continued, this isn't about money, it's about legacy, about fairness. David has always been devoted. Jennifer rose sharply. Objection, that is a subjective characterization unsupported by evidence. Sustained, the judge said. Megan swallowed, her veneer thinning. Then it was our turn. Jennifer methodically presented every document Megan pretended didn't exist. Emails ignored, invitations skipped, messages dripping with entitlement. She showed financial records where Megan had repeatedly borrowed funds through David, promising repayment that never came. She showed notes from Richard's trust attorney proving the estate had always been intended to remain flexible under my control, not theirs. When the judge turned to me, my hands remained still in my lap. Mrs. Edwards, would you like to speak? I rose, feeling the full weight of every year I'd spent being small for the sake of peace. I made choices based on behavior, not bitterness, I said. This wasn't retaliation, it was recognition. I looked at who showed up in my life, who valued me, and who didn't. These decisions were legal, thoughtful, and mine to make. The room was quiet enough to hear someone shift in their seat. For the first time, Megan looked rattled, like she finally understood this wasn't a negotiation she could charm her way through. Her attorney shuffled his papers, scrambling. The judge leaned forward. Mrs. Edwards, your rationale appears consistent and your documentation is thorough. I find no evidence of coercion or incompetence. therefore the updated estate documents remain valid. The gavel struck. Just like that, it was done. Megan didn't move. David remained frozen behind her, his face pale, lips pressed tight as if he were holding back words he no longer knew how to say. Jennifer touched my elbow lightly. Let's go. As we stepped into the hallway, I felt something warm settle inside me, not triumph, not revenge, strength, mine. But just as we reached the courthouse entrance, my phone buzzed in my bag. Unknown number. I answered. A low voice spoke on the other end, strained and breathless. Sylvia, you need to know something, and it can't wait. My stomach tightened. Because it was Megan. And it was David. It was someone who shouldn't have been calling at all. Sylvia, you need to know something, and it can't wait. The voice on the other end was thin but familiar, Richard's former law partner, Mark Collier. We hadn't spoken in over a day. Cade, I stepped aside into the shadow of a pillar just outside the courthouse doors. I'm listening, I said. Megan's been reaching out, he said, rushed. Not just to me, to anyone connected to Richard's firm. She's trying to dig up anything, notes, memos, even casual conversations. Claims he verbally promised the assets to David. She's grasping, but she's not slowing down. My throat tightened, but my voice didn't waver. She's building a backdoor case. She'll try, but there's nothing there, he said. I never heard Richard say a word like that, not once, but she's betting no one will remember that clearly. I do, I said, and so do the records. We hung up. The air outside was cold and dry, but I felt remarkably clear-headed. The courtroom gavel had fallen, but Megan wasn't done clawing, and yet, oddly, I wasn't angry. I was done being surprised by her. That night, I called Jennifer. We sat across from each other in her office, papers spread across the table like a map of everything I had once tried to keep untouched. It's over legally, she said gently, but if she keeps pushing like this, she won't stop until she finds a new leverage point, I said. She's already started spinning new narratives. David will be next, or worse, she'll get to the kids. Jennifer nodded, her fingers steepled. Then let's finalize, lock it all down, every clause, every boundary airtight. She passed me the last stack of paperwork. I signed everything slowly, precisely, making sure every stroke of the pen felt like a door closing behind me. It wasn't just about assets anymore. It was about identity. Mine. When I walked out of the office, I didn't feel light, I felt fortified. A few days later, Megan appeared. Unannounced, on my front step, holding a reusable coffee cup like this was just another casual Saturday. I opened the door halfway, not enough to invite her in. We need to talk, she said. I don't think we do. She gave a clipped smile. You're not thinking clearly. David is devastated. I'm sure, I said, though he hasn't told me that himself. She tried to step forward. I didn't move, neither did the door. I think you're letting people manipulate you, she said, voice softening what she probably thought was persuasion. This legal shift doesn't reflect who you are, the real Sylvia, the woman who used to host Thanksgiving. I tilted my head. You mean the one you uninvited last year? That stopped her. For just a second the mask slipped. Then came the real voice, flat-edged. This isn't over. I know, I said, but I am. And I shut the door. She didn't knock again, just stood there for a moment, then turned and walked down the steps like she still believed the house behind her belonged to her future. It didn't. That evening, I lit a fire and sat with a glass of wine. I didn't rush. No phone, no updates, just the quiet thrum of a house that had finally gone still in all the right ways. I thought of all the versions of myself I had played over the years, peacekeeper, gift giver, silent guest at someone else's table. And I thought of the woman who had walked out of that courtroom without needing to look back. That woman wasn't lost anymore. But even as I settled into the stillness, something gnawed at me. Because Jennifer had mentioned one loose thread that afternoon. Something in the documents Richard left behind. Something Megan hadn't seen yet. And neither had I. Until now. The folder Jennifer had mentioned, the one loose thread, arrived the next morning by courier. A slim binder worn at the edges with Richard's handwriting across the front. I expected paperwork, maybe old correspondence, but as I opened it at the kitchen table, the first page wasn't legal at all. It was a letter, addressed to me. Sylvia, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get to explain things the way I hoped. Please don't let anyone, especially Megan, tell you what your legacy should be. It belongs to you, not them. My breath caught in my throat, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. He made no mention of David inheriting anything. No family line, no intention for the estate to belong to our son, no quiet promise Megan could twist. The one thing she had been trying to fabricate didn't exist. I closed the folder slowly, pressing my palm against the warm wooden table as if to steady myself. Peace didn't come in fireworks, it came in small, steady exhales. Megan had lost the one narrative she thought she could bend to her will. And she knew it. By afternoon, the group chats, neighbors, and mutual acquaintances who had been parroting Megan's sympathetic story suddenly went quiet. Her curated message, the one where she was the wronged daughter-in-law, collapsed under scrutiny. Helen came over with a pie, her version of a congratulations card. She's backing off, Helen said, kicking off her boots. People aren't buying what she's selling anymore. I nodded, feeling the truth of it. Megan wasn't calling. Wasn't texting, not filing new motions, not because she'd accepted defeat, but because she'd realized she no longer had a foothold. She couldn't control the legal outcome. She couldn't control the narrative. And she could no longer control me. The silence she left behind was different from the silence I had chosen. Mine was restorative, hers was calculating. 2 days later, David showed up unannounced. He didn't knock at first. He hesitated on the porch, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like he was debating turning back. When he finally rang the bell, his face looked older than I remembered, tired in a way guilt ages someone. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind me, not shutting him out but not inviting him in either. He rubbed the back of his neck. I should have defended you, I know that now. A part of me softened, not enough to forget the years he stood by while Megan isolated me, but enough to hear him. I didn't want conflict, he continued. I thought staying out of it meant keeping peace, but it just meant letting Megan decide what peace looked like. I didn't respond. His words weren't wrong, they just weren't enough. He exhaled shakily. "I'm sorry, Mom, I really am." For the first time, he wasn't parroting Megan's narrative. He wasn't asking me to reverse the documents. He wasn't complaining about fairness. He was simply apologizing. It didn't fix everything, but it cracked something open, not a doorway but a window, fresh air. Before he left, he looked at me again, eyes hollowed by something Megan couldn't mask. "She's furious," he said, barely above a whisper, "and she doesn't know what to do now that she can't get to you." I nodded. "That's her burden to carry." He swallowed hard. "Be careful." When he walked away, it was the first time I'd seen his shoulders sag under the weight of choosing, really choosing, his own position. The days that followed were quiet in a way I hadn't experienced since long before Megan entered our lives. I cooked for myself, read by the fireplace, took drives along the coast without checking my phone. I felt my life expanding outward from a center I had nearly forgotten belonged to me. I was no longer being defined by someone else's expectations. My future was mine again. Meanwhile, Megan's attempts to claw back control collapsed one by one. Her public concern dried up. Her legal team withdrew their latest appeal after Jennifer dismantled it within 24 hours. Even the whispers among neighbors faded as her story unraveled. Every failed attempt loosened her grip on David, on the narrative, on the illusion that she was the one directing our family's path. My strength didn't come from punishing her. It came from choosing myself. But the peace that settled in those days carried a strange undercurrent, an awareness that quiet can sometimes be a prelude, not a conclusion. It arrived in the form of a voicemail. Not from Megan. Not from David. From an unknown woman whose trembling voice said, "Mrs. Edwards, you don't know me, but I know Megan, and I think you need to hear what she's planning next." My fingers tightened around the phone. Because Megan's retreat wasn't surrender, it was strategy. I never called the woman back. Not because I wasn't curious, I was. But because for the first time in years I didn't want to meet a storm halfway, I wanted to live in the stillness I had earned. And so I did. I booked a flight to Lisbon, a place Richard and I had once circled in a guidebook but never visited. I stayed in a small apartment overlooking the Tagus where the walls were whitewashed and the mornings smelled like espresso and sea salt. No itinerary, no one to appease, just me walking stone alleyways at my own pace, dining alone without feeling lonely. It was strange at first how foreign freedom felt. Not the legal kind, the emotional kind. The kind that didn't ask for permission. At a cafe in Alfama, I met an older woman named Sophia who taught me how to order properly in Portuguese. We shared a slice of almond cake, and by the second day she called me amiga and insisted I join her and her friends for fado music in a cellar that pulsed with heartbreak and history. The music was heavy, but the laughter that followed was light. When I returned home, I didn't fall back into old patterns, I moved forward. I went to lectures at the museum, signed up for a pottery class I'd been too afraid to take before, worried my hands might shake or someone might whisper that I didn't belong. They didn't. I belonged there, I belonged anywhere I chose to be. Helen hosted a small gathering when I got back, not a party, just wine, soup, music, and women who spoke freely. No politics, no gossip, just warmth. I don't think I've ever seen you look this full, Helen said, studying me. Full of yourself, she smiled, in the best way. I laughed, but she was right. For once, I wasn't bracing for impact. David called sometimes, short calls, no expectations, just effort. He asked how I was, what I was doing, what I was reading. I kept the conversations short but civil. I didn't bring up Megan, neither did he. I wasn't punishing him, I was protecting myself. There's a difference. One night I sat on my back porch under a wool blanket watching the stars shimmer beyond the sycamores. My phone buzzed, a message from David. I know I have a lot to make up for, but I'm proud of you. I hope that matters even a little. It did. But not in the way he meant. Because for so long I had chased pride like a distant light, waiting for it to come from someone else's mouth, his, Richard's, even Megan's. Now I didn't need it spoken. I carried it in my chest. And Megan. She vanished slowly. No more messages, no more demands. I heard through Helen that they'd listed the lake house, her backup dreams slipping through her fingers. Her name faded from conversation, even among those who once spoke of her glowingly. It wasn't that she had been erased. She had simply become irrelevant to my story. I thought that moment would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt like closure. At the farmer's market one Saturday, I ran into someone from Richard's firm, an associate I hadn't seen since the funeral. She looked startled to see me smiling, dressed in bright linen, holding a bouquet of marigolds. You look well, she said. I am. And I was, not because the battle was won, but because I had finally stopped living like I was waiting to lose something. That evening I hosted a dinner, just 5 people, friends, no family. The table was imperfect, plates didn't match, wine spilled, music skipped. But laughter filled every corner. It was a celebration, not of survival but of sovereignty. Near the end of the meal, Helen raised her glass. To Sylvia, she said, for choosing herself. Everyone clinked. And just as I sat down, warm with wine and relief, my phone buzzed once more. Not David. Not Megan. Not unknown. It was a name I hadn't seen in 20 years. A name I had nearly forgot. But not quite. And whatever came next, I was ready to face it. The name on the screen stayed there for a long time before I moved. Lillian Morin. Richard's sister. We hadn't spoken in 20 years, not since the memorial service for his mother, when a single comment about estate fairness split the room in half. She hadn't come to Richard's funeral, I hadn't reached out, a stalemate forged in silence. I didn't answer. Not that night, not the next. The truth is, I didn't need to know what she wanted. Whatever it was, information, sympathy, another side of a story long told, I wasn't available for revisionist history. My life wasn't up for debate. So I let it go. And for once, the silence didn't feel like a hole, it felt like a wall I was finally allowed to build. I started walking again, not for exercise, for rhythm. There was something about the way the world moved in early morning, soft light, distant traffic, strangers nodding at each other with a kind of quiet grace. I'd stop by the bakery for coffee, browse the paper goods shop on Elm, buy flowers I didn't need. One morning, the clerk at the market slipped a sprig of rosemary into my bag. "It's for remembering," she said with a wink, "or forgetting." I didn't ask what she meant. David called more regularly now, not daily, not urgently, just gently. He never asked for anything, not forgiveness, not fave. He simply offered space. He told me about his job, his kids, what he was cooking. Sometimes he asked about my pottery class or whether I'd seen the moon that week. It wasn't a rebuilding, it was a reintroduction. He wasn't asking to return to who we were. He was trying to meet me where I was now. And that mattered. But I didn't rush toward it, or him. Because I'd learned something painful and precious. Just because someone regrets the damage doesn't mean they're ready to prevent more. Healing doesn't mean reunion, sometimes it just means peace. One afternoon, I received an envelope in the mail, thick cream paper, no return address. Inside was a photo of Megan and the kids, taken at what looked like a beach house. A note was scrawled across the back in her looping script. No matter what happened, we were still family. I turned it over once, twice. Then I dropped it into the recycling bin without hesitation. She hadn't called, she hadn't visited, she hadn't asked for forgiveness. She had only sent an image and implication, a message dressed as sentiment, dripping with nostalgia she never earned. I didn't need to perform a reaction. Indifference was the cleanest boundary I'd ever set. That weekend, I planted a garden. Not a metaphorical one, a real one, herbs mostly, tomatoes, lavender. I found myself kneeling in the dirt with music in my ears and no thought in my head except how the soil felt between my fingers. I bought new wind chimes, painted my mailbox, let the neighbor's cat sleep on my porch chair. Every small choice stitched a new life together. It was quiet. And deeply mine. Helen and I planned a trip to Vancouver for the fall. Art galleries, good food, fog. We laughed about renting electric bikes and how long it might take us to forgive each other if one of us crashed into a lamppost. "This is what starting over looks like," she said as we sat on my back porch with glasses of wine. "No," I said, smiling, "this is what starting finally looks like." That night I made a list, something I hadn't done since Richard died, not for groceries or errands, a real list. At the top I wrote things I still want. It wasn't long. But it was honest. One of them was to write again, just for myself, just to remember the sound of my own voice without someone editing it from the inside. I sat at my desk, pulled out a fresh page, and just as I picked up the pen, my phone buzzed. Another message. But this time, not from a name I recognized at all. Just 4 words. "You don't know me." And below it, a second line. "But I knew Richard." The message stayed unread for hours. "You don't know me, but I knew Richard." It was too vague to be threatening, too personal to ignore. I finally opened it near midnight, my desk lamp casting a halo over the page I hadn't written a word on. Her name was Claire Winston. She'd worked with Richard at the firm in the early 90s. Junior analyst, barely out of law school, she wrote, but he was kind, always asked about my parents, treated me like I had something to say. Then near the end, I watched the fallout with Megan from afar. "I don't want anything, I just wanted to say Richard was proud of you. He spoke about your strength more than once. I thought you should know." I closed my eyes, not to cry, to absorb, not for Richard or even for Claire, but for the version of me who spent years believing no one saw the weight I carried. They had. I started writing the next morning. Not for publication, not for a blog, just in a cheap spiral notebook from the corner store. It began simply. I was the kind of woman who said yes when I meant maybe, who stayed quiet to avoid being called difficult, who kept the peace until there was nothing peaceful left in me. Each day I added to it, stories, fragments, reflections. I didn't name Megan or even David, not directly, but the shape of them lived in the lines. I wrote about the slow erosion of boundaries disguised as love, the way some people drain you without ever raising their voice, the ache of realizing you've given decades to people who never said thank you, only finally. And I wrote about reclaiming space emotionally, physically, legally, about lavender blooming in the yard I once thought of selling, about learning that silence could be sacred, about choosing self-respect over second chances. Helen read a few pages. "This isn't just writing," she said, "it's permission for women like us." Months passed like steady breath, quiet and full. I submitted a short essay to a regional literary journal. They published it under the title The Cost of Inheritance. Emails poured in, some angry, some grateful, most said the same thing. I thought I was the only one. Turns out there are more of us than anyone cares to admit, women who smiled through holidays, paid for ballet lessons, stayed quiet at dinner tables we set ourselves. Now they were reaching out, calling it by name. Emotional erasure, financial expectation, the kind of control you can't see until you've already signed it away. My story had given them language. And in doing so, I'd finally found mine. David called again. It was a voicemail this time. He sounded tired, honest. "I've been thinking a lot about you, about what I let happen. I didn't defend you because I was scared of losing peace, but now I see I lost you instead." He paused then. "I know you don't owe me anything, but if you ever want to talk, I'll be here for as long as it takes." I didn't delete it, I didn't respond either. Some bridges aren't burned, they're just not worth rebuilding. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And that's okay. In spring, I booked a train trip up the coast. Window seat, journal in my lap, no destination I couldn't change halfway through. I met people, an artist who sketched everyone's shoes, a widow from Montana who wore red lipstick every morning because, why the hell not? I told no one my full story. But when they asked what I did, I said, I write. And it was true. On my way home, a woman recognized me from the essay. She didn't interrupt me, she simply placed a note on my table and kept walking. It said, "Thank you for reminding me that choosing myself isn't selfish, it's survival." That night back home, I returned to my desk. The notebook was full now. I pulled out a new one, labeled it in pen. Volume 2. Because my story wasn't over. I was just finally the one writing it. But before I could start the first page, my email chimed. A subject line that froze me. Request for interview, national broadcast. And below it, "We read your piece, we'd like to hear your voice." The interview aired on a Thursday morning, subtle, unadorned, threaded with clips of my voice reading passages from my journal. I didn't watch it live. Helen did, so did neighbors, so did strangers who later wrote to say they recognized themselves in my pauses, my breath, my steadiness. I watched it that evening alone with a cup of tea cooling in my hands. I didn't look polished or rehearsed. I looked like a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for surviving. By the next week, a small publisher reached out. They wanted more than the essay, they wanted the whole story. I hesitated, wondering if speaking louder meant inviting old shadows to come looking for me again. But something inside me whispered, "This time you're not hiding." I agreed. The writing came faster than I expected. Years of swallowed feelings unfurled onto the page. The book wasn't a memoir exactly, it was a map. A guide for anyone who had ever been convinced that their needs were inconveniences, their boundaries selfish, their worth negotiable. When it launched, I thought it would just exist, quietly. It didn't. It spread, not virally but steadily, shared hand to hand in book clubs and community centers, in quiet circles of women who had spent years believing they were alone. A retired teacher sent me a photo of 12 dog-eared copies lined up on a table. A college student emailed to say she left her boyfriend after reading chapter 7. Someone mailed me a bracelet shaped like a small open door. My story had become a lantern. Megan's unraveling came secondhand, small details carried on the wind. She tried to mend fences with Richard's relatives, but they were polite only out of obligation. She made a few posts online about holding family together, but they were met with thin, uncomfortable silence. Even the neighbors she once charmed with curated kindness kept their distance now, cautious of the sharpness beneath her smile. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't even justice. It was exposure. Sometimes truth doesn't need to shout, it just stands still long enough for the lies to fall away. I was invited to speak at a women's empowerment event in Chicago, then a conference in Atlanta. A nonprofit asked if I'd consult on a project for elder financial protection. I never expected any of this. But when I stepped onto those stages, soft lights, rows of strangers leaning forward, it didn't feel foreign. It felt like the natural continuation of every boundary I'd finally dared to draw. After one event, a woman in her 70s squeezed my hands and whispered, "I didn't know it was allowed to choose myself." Her tears landed on my wrist. Something within me shifted, a sensation both grounding and electric. Mountain Twist 3. At a Boston seminar, a young woman approached me after my talk. She looked nervous, twisting her bracelet. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, she murmured, but Megan reached out to me last year. She asked if anyone in your community group would testify that you were mentally slipping. She wanted statements. She said she'd handle the details. I didn't give her anything, but others she tried. The air around me thinned, but I stayed upright. Megan hadn't just fought the will, she'd tried to build a case about my sanity. A line she had never crossed before. And now I knew. I returned home with a sharpened clarity, not fear, clarity. I called Jennifer, told her what I'd learned. She listened quietly, her breath measured. "Sylvia," she said finally, "this isn't desperation anymore, this is escalation." I stared at the garden through the window, lavender swaying in the wind, leaves trembling but rooted. "I won't let her rewrite my mind," I said. "You won't," Jennifer agreed, "but we may need to prepare for what she does next." David and I found a slow equilibrium. He visited sometimes. We took walks, talked about books. He apologized, not with grand gestures but with consistency. Trust regrew like moss, quiet, stubborn, patient. He never defended Megan anymore. That told me more than his words ever could. With book royalties coming in, I invested in programs that mattered: literacy funds, women's shelters, legal aid for seniors. My legacy wasn't property anymore, it was impact, it was agency. It was mine. And as I stood in my kitchen one evening, sealing an envelope with a donation to a local advocacy group, I felt something I hadn't in decades. Direction. But then the doorbell rang. A single chime, soft, measured. I opened it. And froze. Because the person on my porch wasn't Megan. It was someone who shouldn't have known my address at all. Someone whose presence meant the past was not done shifting. Not yet. The man on my porch was in his late 60s, dressed neatly with silver at his temples and a calm in his eyes that didn't match the knot twisting in my stomach. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," he said softly. "I'm Daniel." The name didn't ring a bell, but the envelope he held, aged, carefully sealed, had Richard's handwriting on it. "I worked with your husband," he added. "He asked me to deliver this to you, eventually." My fingers curled around the frame of the door. "Why now?" He hesitated. "Because I think you've earned it." I didn't invite him in, I didn't need to. Whatever this was, it was for me and me alone. After he left, I stood in the kitchen, the envelope on the counter like a stone I wasn't sure I wanted to lift. But I opened it. Inside was a single-page letter, dated 5 months before Richard died. It wasn't about property or regrets. It was a confession. He'd seen how Megan treated me, he hadn't known how to stop it. He wrote of the nights he heard my silence and didn't ask, of the way he watched me shrink to preserve peace and mistook it for strength. "I thought time would fix it," he wrote, "but time didn't, and I'm sorry I made you wait for it too." I sat down, let the weight of his words settle next to my tea. I didn't cry. I just felt seen. Even in the quiet of memory, he had left behind a final recognition, one that wasn't asked for, just offered. And in that offering, something finally clicked into place. Forgiveness not for him but for myself, for staying, for waiting, for thinking I needed someone else to name my pain before I could own it. Spring blurred into summer. I traveled again, Montreal, Edinburgh, even a small writing retreat in Santa Fe where no one cared what I had endured, only what I had to say. At home, I replaced curtains with sheer linen that let the light in. I donated old furniture that no longer felt like mine. The house didn't just look different, it breathed differently, freer. Megan's silence held not even a shadow of contact, the kind of absence that once would have made me brace. Now I barely noticed. Because letting go doesn't require ceremony. Just decision. David came by one Sunday, no reason, just showed up with lemons from his yard. We sat on the back steps in the late afternoon light, the breeze warm and scented with rosemary from the garden. I've been thinking, he said quietly, how much of my life was shaped by silence. I looked at him. And now, I'm learning to listen, not just to you but to myself. We didn't need to say more. Some relationships aren't repaired with big moments. They're rebuilt in stillness, in showing up, in saying less and meaning more. I hosted a dinner that summer. Not for an occasion, just because the sun lingered longer in the sky and I had enough chairs for everyone I cared about. There was music, laughter, someone spilled wine, someone danced badly. I didn't worry about the napkins not matching. Helen toasted me again, this time without raising a glass. She simply looked across the table and said, "You've changed the shape of your life, Sylvia." And I had. Not into something bigger. Into something true. One morning, I sat by the window with a pen in hand and realized I hadn't thought of Megan in weeks. Not with anger, not with fear, not with hope. Just not at all. And that was the peace. Not the absence of pain, but the absence of longing for it to be anything else. I checked the mail that afternoon, just a few envelopes, a catalog, one letter. From a university press. They'd read my book, they wanted to adapt part of it into curriculum for their women and justice program. I pressed the envelope to my chest. And smiled. Because legacy wasn't what I left behind. It was what I lived. But as I walked back toward the house, my phone buzzed with a new message. This time from an unexpected name I did recognize. Lillian. Richard's sister. After 20 years of silence. And her message said only, "We need to talk before it's too late." The morning after Lillian's message, I made tea the way I always did. Loose leaves, one sugar, no hurry. I didn't call her. Not because I held a grudge, I didn't, not anymore, but because I had learned finally that not every open door is meant to be walked through, some are simply meant to stay closed softly without force. Instead, I carried my tea to the garden barefoot, wrapped in a linen robe the color of sea foam. The lavender had come in early this year. I leaned down, brushing my fingers across the blooms. They didn't resist. They didn't explain. They simply grew. I had become something like that. Not louder, just more rooted. These days, I spent my mornings writing or walking, my afternoons volunteering at the community library or reviewing grant applications for women-led nonprofits. My evenings were for myself, long baths, thick novels, simple food, soft jazz on the radio. No one asked anything of me, and no part of me longed to be asked. The book had found its audience, a quiet revolution. It didn't top any charts, it wasn't splashed across news segments or profiled by influencers, but it moved, slowly, purposefully, the way real change does. It was passed from daughter to mother, from sister to friend, from silence to voice. I started receiving letters, not emails, real letters, in looping cursive on thick paper with return addresses from places I'd never been. "You made me feel seen. I thought I was crazy until I read your story. My daughter is safer because I am stronger." Every one of them was a mirror, reflecting not just who I had become, but what I had survived. I was asked to give the closing keynote at a summit on financial autonomy for women. I nearly said no, but Helen, ever practical, poured me a glass of wine and said, "You've already taught so much. This time, let them see your face." So I did. The room was wide and warm, full of women with open eyes and folded notebooks. I didn't read from a script, I didn't need to, I spoke the way I'd once only thought in my head, clear, unbothered, unedited. When I was done, they stood. Not for applause, but for acknowledgement. And that, more than anything, became the shape of my legacy. Not inheritance. Not wealth. But witness. Megan hadn't made contact in months. Not a message, not a whisper. Whatever game she thought she was playing had collapsed beneath the weight of truth she could no longer bend. I didn't hate her. I didn't think about her at all. And that, I realized, was what real freedom felt like, not absence of pain, but absence of tether. David and I stayed in touch, gently, no pressure, no repair schedule. We weren't mother and son returning to what we once were. We were two people learning to see each other without the lens of guilt, and that was enough. More than enough. One morning, I walked through my house and realized I had filled it with things that made me feel alive. Art by women who had once gone unseen. Books stacked on every surface, annotated in the margins. Windows left open even when it rained. I had built a life that didn't just look like mine. It was mine. Every soft moment, every hard boundary, every slow, patient truth. At the very end of summer, I was asked to write the foreword to an anthology of essays by women who had once been caregivers, fixers, peacekeepers. I accepted. And when I sat down to write it, I didn't have to think about what to say. I just wrote what I had lived. They tried to take everything from me. In the end, I gave them nothing. And gained everything.